Ever stop to think that what feels utterly solid around you might, might not be so solid after all?
It's a strange thought, isn't it?
Yeah, imagine reality is more of like a vibrant, energetic flow.
Yeah.
That's the kind of mind-bending territory we're stepping into today.
It's intriguing how this notion that the physical world has this deeper, more dynamic nature. It kind of resonates across different times and, schools of thought.
Absolutely. And our guide for this exploration is Pietro Ubaldi and his, pretty ambitious work, The Great Synthesis.
Right.
Now, this isn't just, another philosophical text. This book really sets out to weave together these threads that seem separate, science, philosophy, even spirituality, into one big unified understanding of the universe.
A huge undertaking.
Totally. And get this, the preface itself is just buzzing with endorsements. You've got scientists, philosophers, writers, all pointing to its profound scientific, social, and philosophical content and its sublime vision of wisdom and love. Sounds pretty epic, right?
It does. It really highlights that fundamental human quest, doesn't it? To find like coherence and meaning in all this vastness and complexity.
Exactly. So for you tuning in, our deep dive today is going to pull out some of the core ideas from the Great Synthesis that really challenge the way we typically think about what's real and, our place in it all. Think of it as getting a sort of backstage pass to a truly unconventional perspective.
It makes you wonder, though, in a world just overflowing with information, how do we actually, sort out the profound insight from just more description?
That's a great question.
Ubaldi's work seems to attempt at least to provide a framework for that very process of discernment.
And we're not just skimming the surface here. We'll be touching on, everything from the basic nature of matter and energy right through to evolution, consciousness, and those, mysterious underlying laws that seem to govern everything.
Okay.
Okay, let's jump in. Ubaldi has some pretty strong opinions on where conventional science falls short.
Right, the limitations.
Yeah. He argues it gets kind of bogged down in endless analysis, constantly dissecting things, but missing the bigger picture, the very great synthesis he's aiming for.
So the focus on the parts obscures the whole.
Precisely. The key insight here is that by only focusing on breaking things down, science risks losing sight of how everything actually connects.
What's fascinating is his argument that even with all our, advanced tools, our reliance on just sensory perception keeps us sort of stuck on a superficial layer of reality.
Yeah, like trying to understand a symphony by, I don't know, just looking at the violins or something.
Exactly, without hearing the music.
He suggests this keeps us on the surface, as he puts it, and actually stops us from getting a deeper, more holistic understanding. And he even brings up this concept, ignorbivus.
Latin, yeah. We shall never know.
Right. His point is that science, in its current sort of analytical mode, might just hit a wall, unable to truly grasp the fundamental nature of things. He even asks if science has become more about, like, generating conveniences rather than really chasing profound truths. So the takeaway here is that purely objective investigation might just have built-in limits when it comes to uncovering the deepest realities.
Which raises a really crucial question about knowledge itself, doesn't it? Can we truly understand the universe just by observing it from the outside? Or is there maybe a role for other ways of knowing?
Which leads perfectly into his point about intuition.
Ah, yes.
Ubaldi argues that intuition isn't some, vague, unscientific feeling, but actually an essential faculty, something we need for gaining deeper understanding.
So not replacing reason, but complementing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He even poses this really thought-provoking question. Has science ever considered that maybe a certain level of, moral purity might actually be needed to truly understand the universe?
Wow, that's pretty radical.
It is, suggesting our inner state might actually influence our capacity for knowledge. The core insight, I think, is that understanding might require more than just, intellectual horsepower. It might involve a kind of refinement of our whole being.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, you can definitely see parallels with the various philosophical and spiritual traditions that emphasize inner work, ethical development, as pathways to deeper wisdom.
For sure. He talks about the need to, quote, transfer their own self with its sensibility into the center of the phenomenon.
Right. Not just observe it from afar.
Exactly. To really grasp it, not just look at it externally. It's about achieving this kind of deep resonance, a true transfusion of soul, as he puts it.
Okay.
Now, this idea directly informs his view of matter and energy. He states, and this is really central, that matter in all its forms, right down to the tiniest bits, is upheld, guided and organized by the spirit.
Spirit meaning consciousness or something broader.
He seemed to mean some form of conscious organizing principle or intelligence that he believes permeates everything, just in varying degrees. So the key takeaway is that spirit isn't just something that showed up later with life, but it's fundamental to the very fabric of reality.
That's fascinating. The implication there is that consciousness, or at least some form of underlying intelligence, isn't just a byproduct of complex physical stuff, but might be, well, a primary aspect of the cosmos itself.
Exactly. And he goes on to explain that what we experience as solid matter is essentially a form of energy.
Okay, like ECSE.
Sort of, yeah, but with his own spin. Solidity, he suggests, is almost an illusion created by the incredibly rapid movement of electrons within atoms. Think of like a spinning fan blade, right?
Yeah, it looks like a solid disk.
Exactly. The individual blades disappear. He even uses the sun's radioactivity as an example of matter transforming into energy, this passage gamma to beta, as he called it, referring to a shift in energy emission. The core idea here is that matter and energy aren't fundamentally separate things. They're just different expressions of the same underlying reality.
Okay, that aligns in a way with the scientific understanding of mass-energy equivalence, sure. But Ubaldi seems to be adding this layer of, like, spiritual agency, suggesting some intelligent force orchestrating these transformations.
Yes, precisely. Now, things get really interesting when he introduces the law of evolution, ascent, and involution, descent.
Okay, the cycles.
Yeah, he views existence as this grand, ongoing cycle with these two complementary movements. Like, imagine a cloud of gas, a nebula, condensing to form a star, and planets that's kind of like involution, a movement towards form, towards density.
Right, coming together.
Then imagine that star eventually dying, its matter dispersing back out into space. That's evolution in his context, a return to a less defined state, kind of back towards pure energy. It's all part of the same continuous cosmic dance.
So creation and destruction aren't endpoints, just phases.
Exactly. Phases in a larger cyclical process. That's the key insight.
If we connect this to broader ideas, you can definitely see echoes of this cyclical view in, well, various ancient cosmologies and even in modern science, like the life cycles of stars and galaxies.
Totally. And he quotes this really fundamental principle. Nothing is created, nothing is destroyed, but all is transformed.
Lavoisier, yeah, but applied cosmically?
Right. It's this constant state of flux and change. He even mentions there's a formula that unites these two movements, hinting at some kind of mathematical underpinning to this whole cosmic cycle.
Interesting.
Then he introduces the trinal nature of reality. For Ubaldi, the concept of Trinity isn't just, a theological idea. He sees it as a fundamental principle woven into the very structure of existence.
A recurring pattern of three.
Kind of, yeah. He sees it reflected in divinity itself, the creation of the universe, and in countless aspects of our experience. Think of it like a fundamental three-part harmony underlying, well, everything.
What's fascinating is how he identifies this triadic pattern across totally different domains. He gives examples like static, which is rest, dynamic movement, and mechanical interaction,
Right.
or space, system consciousness, and other dimensions of reality, and even in us, the physical body, the animating life force or dynamism, and the guiding spirit.
So it's a way of seeing a basic organizational principle just repeating itself everywhere on all levels.
Exactly. The core insight is that reality seems to operate on this fundamental three-part structure.
Okay, he then delves into the progression of matter, starting with hydrogen. He calls it the simplest element, H1.
The building block.
Yeah, he points out how in chemistry, the atomic weights of everything else are based on hydrogen. For him, this isn't just like a convenience. It signifies hydrogen as the original, most fundamental form of matter from which everything else has evolved.
So, a hierarchy of complexity starting from the simplest.
Right. That's the key takeaway there.
And that aligns pretty well with our scientific understanding, doesn't it? Hydrogen being the most abundant element, the fuel for stars where heavier elements are made.
It does, and it gets
Yeah.
even more detailed. He talks about the periodic return of isovalences. In chemical elements, the repeating patterns in how they bond, like in the periodic table.
Yeah, the groups, the columns.
Right. He sees these patterns occurring in these cycles of 7. He interprets them as vast rhythmical pulsations of matter happening in 7 series. It suggests an underlying order, a rhythm in the very building blocks of the universe.
Like a musical motif, almost?
Yeah, exactly. Like a recurring musical motif in the symphony of matter. The core insight is that there are these repeating patterns and rhythms even at the most fundamental levels.
This mirroring of patterns at different scales, From atoms to potentially larger cosmic structures, that's a recurring theme in many attempts to find unifying principles, isn't it?
Definitely. Okay, so we've looked at physical matter, but Ubaldi argues the evolutionary scale keeps going beyond that into what he calls dynamic and psychical evolution.
So not just atoms and molecules.
No, the progression doesn't stop at the heaviest elements.
Huh?
He sees dynamic forms of energy. Think X-rays, light, electromagnetic vibrations, sound is the next stage in this evolutionary process. And interestingly, he suggests this progression also shows those same septenary periods, groups of 7, and progresses by octaves, just like he described for the chemical elements.
So the same underlying pattern continues into the energy realm.
That seems to be the idea. The key insight here is that evolution isn't just physical. It extends into energy and, as we'll see, beyond.
What's fascinating is this idea of a continuous spectrum of evolution where maybe the same basic principles of organization and progression apply to both tangible stuff and these more, well, intangible forms of energy.
And from these dynamic forms, he moves into the psychical realm.
Consciousness.
Yeah, starting with what he describes as a minimal level of psychism or consciousness, even in crystals.
In crystals, wow.
Yeah, he points out that crystallography identifies 7 crystalline systems, maybe suggesting this increasing complexity and more evident psychism as we move up this scale towards what we normally call life.
That's a pretty radical idea, attributing some basic awareness even to inanimate matter.
It is. The core takeaway is that consciousness, maybe in some super rudimentary form, might be way more pervasive in the universe than we typically assume.
That certainly challenges the sharp line we usually draw between living and non-living. Suggests more of a gradual emergence, maybe.
Then he emphasizes that life is constant exchange and transformation.
Yeah.
It's not static.
Right, metabolism.
Exactly. Within living organisms, matter is continuously being swapped out, transformed at every level, from atoms to cells. He describes this vertiginous cycle of birth, life, and death happening constantly inside us.
So your body isn't really a fixed thing at all.
Not according to this. Think of it more like a dynamic river of atoms and molecules, constantly flowing, constantly changing. The key insight is just how dynamic and ever-changing life is, right down to its roots.
And that fits perfectly with our biological understanding of metabolism, the constant turnover of cells and molecules in living systems.
He then lays out the typical trajectory of phenomenal motions. He proposes this kind of law governing how phenomena develop. It involves cycles of progression and regression.
3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
Kind of, yeah. Before anything truly stabilizes or gets locked in, it goes through these phases multiple times. It advances, falls back a bit, advances again, repeating this cycle before it's, quote, definitively assimilated.
Okay.
He uses the analogy of seed.
Mm-hmm.
The full potential is all concentrated in the germ first, before it can sprout and actually grow.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process of trying, adjusting, solidifying.
So development isn't usually a straight line. It involves these cycles of progress and setbacks before reaching a stable state. That's the core idea.
I think so, yeah.
That idea of repeated cycles with variations before reaching stability, it resonates with concepts of learning, doesn't it? And adaptation, even evolutionary processes that involve trial and error.
Absolutely. And this leads him to the hierarchical structure of the universe. Ubaldi sees everything organized into these nested collective units.
Like Russian dolls.
Exactly like Russian dolls. Each organism is made of smaller ones and is itself part of a bigger one, and this extends infinitely, he suggests, in both directions, from the tiniest atom all the way up to the entire universe.
So interconnectedness and hierarchy across all scales.
That's the core insight, yeah.
And if you look across different fields, you do see this hierarchical structure everywhere, right? Atoms make molecules, make cells, make tissue.
And organisms make ecosystems.
Make planets, solar systems, galaxies. Yeah, it's a pretty universal pattern.
Next up, relativity of measurement. He argues pretty strongly that there's no absolute ruler, no absolute standard of measurement or dimension in the universe. Everything is relative.
Relative to the observer.
To the observer, to the context, yeah.
Yeah.
Even our seemingly fixed systems, like science and math, he says, are immersed in this relativity. The absolute always kind of eludes our grasp.
Okay.
The key insight is simply that our understanding of the universe is always framed by our perspective and the tools we happen to be using to measure it.
Which aligns pretty directly with Einstein's theory of relativity, obviously. That fundamentally shifted our view of space and time away from being absolute.
Right. And Building on that, he discusses the evolution of dimension itself.
Dimension evolves.
Apparently so, in his view. He sees space as this fundamental triphasic unity, again with the three, and time emerges as a new conceptual dimension, almost like a fourth dimension, but in a different kind of system, arising from movement and change happening within space.
That's tricky to grasp.
It is. The idea, I guess, is that even the very fabric of reality, our concepts of space and time, might not be fixed containers, but could be evolving aspects of the universe itself.
So dimensions aren't just static stages, but dynamic aspects that arise because of what's happening within them.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Then he tackles the genesis of gravitation. He offers a broader view than just, Newton's idea of a simple attractive force.
Okay, so he sees it more as a dynamic equilibrium involving both attraction and repulsion that arises directly from motion and kinetic energy at a really fundamental level.
Attraction and repulsion.
Yeah. He even suggests that gravity isn't instantaneous, it takes time to propagate, and has its own wavelength, kind of like light or other fundamental forces.
Okay, well, the time propagation and speed of light aspect certainly aligns with modern physics, with general relativity. The attraction-repulsion interplay at the fundamental level is maybe more speculative, but it's an interesting take.
Yeah, the core insight is that gravity isn't just a simple pull, but maybe a more complex interplay of forces born from the universe's fundamental dynamics.
Right.
Now, we get to a really, really central principle for Ubaldi. Duality is a fundamental law.
Okay, opposites.
Exactly. He sees the very nature of, well, non-being dividing itself into these inverse but complementary halves, like opposing forces, positive, negative, active, passive, that drive the entire evolutionary process forward.
Through tension.
Through a constantly shifting, unstable, but ultimately self-renewing equilibrium created by that tension. Think of the push and pull, the ebb and flow you see in so many natural systems. He gives examples like activity and passivity, grief and joy, even death and life.
So the engine of change is this fundamental tension between opposites.
That's the core insight, yeah.
And this concept of duality, of opposing yet interconnected forces driving creation and change. That's a massive theme in countless philosophical and spiritual systems across the world, isn't it? Yin and yang, for instance.
Absolutely. And this fundamental duality, for Ubaldi, explains the role of pain and struggle.
Ah, so they have a purpose.
Yes. They aren't meaningless suffering, in his view, but actually necessary conditions for consciousness to develop, for higher forms of life to emerge. It's through facing challenges, experiencing contrasts, that we learn, that we grow.
So adversity is actually fuel for development.
That seems to be the core insight, that it plays a crucial role in developing consciousness and driving progress.
That offers a really different way of framing difficulties, doesn't it? Not just as obstacles, but as integral parts of our growth and understanding.
Definitely. And all of these ideas, they really culminate in the understanding that true progress requires the importance of inner transformation.
Yay.
A purification of our psychical instrument, basically, our inner selves, our consciousness. External advancements, technology, whatever, they aren't enough on their own. Real evolution needs inner development to go along with it.
So personal internal growth is essential. That's the core insight.
Yes.
Which emphasizes the subjective side of evolution, doesn't it? Outward progress needs to be matched by an inner refinement of our capacities and our understanding.
He even anticipates the coming new civilization of the third millennium. He sees it as a significant shift, moving from the purely human phase to a kind of a superhuman phase.
Superhuman.
Yeah, and he believes this shift will require a whole new approach to gaining knowledge, one that fully integrates intuition alongside rational thought.
So a transformation in how we know and how we exist.
Pretty much. The core insight is that the future evolution of humanity might involve a really significant shift in our ways of knowing and being.
That speaks to a potential future where maybe our cognitive abilities, our whole understanding of reality, could undergo a radical change.
And here's a really powerful idea. Ubaldi believes in the eternal value of actions.
Every single action.
Every single act, yeah. No matter how small it seems, he thinks it gets imprinted somehow on our latent consciousness and contributes to shaping our eternal self.
Wow. So everything matters. Permanently.
That's the core insight.
Yeah.
Our actions have these lasting consequences, shaping our inner being in ways that go beyond our immediate awareness.
That certainly underscores the profound significance of our choices, our actions. Suggests they have repercussions far beyond what we might perceive right now.
And ultimately, what's the goal? What's the point of this entire grand cosmic process? According to Ubaldi, it's a return to God.
A spiritual journey.
Exactly. He views evolution as fundamentally a spiritual ascent, a journey back towards a state of unity and true happiness with the divine, with God the Father and Creator, as he puts it. And the great synthesis itself is presented as a kind of call to embrace this better, wider, and higher life.
So the ultimate purpose is spiritual return and reconnection.
That's the final takeaway, yeah.
So bringing it all together, Ubaldi paints this vast interconnected picture, doesn't he? A universe that's fundamentally dynamic, driven by some kind of spiritual impulse, constantly evolving towards higher levels of complexity, consciousness, and ultimately unity.
Okay, so for you listening, what are some of the key things to maybe pull out from this deep dive into Ubaldi's great synthesis?
Well, first, he really challenges us to look beyond the surface, doesn't he?
That's right.
Suggesting that solid matter is more like an energetic dance, maybe orchestrated by spirit. He presents this really compelling idea of existence as a continuous cycle, evolution and involution, this cosmic breath of creation and return.
And all driven by that fundamental tension of duality, the opposites. Right. And crucially, he highlights the importance of intuition.
Yes, as a vital tool, not just feelings, but a tool for truly understanding the universe, working with our rational minds, not against them.
He suggests that genuine insight needs, well, a deeper, more personal engagement with reality.
Mm-hmm.
And it all seems to point towards this profound interconnectedness of everything spirit and matter, our individual actions, and there may be eternal consequences, all woven into this huge, evolving cosmic tapestry.
With a clear direction, in his view, that return to the divine source.
Which brings us to a really important point for you to maybe mull over.
Yeah.
If our physical reality is indeed just one phase in this immense eternal cycle of transformation and is driven by some kind of spiritual impulse, how might that understanding reshape your perspective on your own life journey, the challenges you face?
That's a deep question. Or thinking about Ubaldi's arguments about the limits of purely rational thought, what parts of your own life maybe might you approach differently if you started to consciously cultivate and trust your intuition, your inner knowing, a bit more?
Exactly. Look, this deep dive has really only scratched the surface. It's a truly monumental and definitely thought-provoking work.
For sure.
If any of these ideas have sparked your curiosity, I would wholeheartedly encourage you to delve further into the great synthesis itself. Explore these concepts in more detail. It's quite a journey of intellectual discovery, and maybe, for some, a journey of spiritual awakening, too.